The first time I saw the 13th floor was just a few days ago, and I hope I will never see it again. It was a normal Monday, and I was exhausted after a long day of work. I work as a nurse at Westview Hospital, and my shifts were always draining, especially that day since I had to work a double. Finally, my shift ended, and I hurried out the door. I appreciated not having to worry about parking in a city that was normally so busy. Living so close to work had its advantages. Westview was often still bustling at that hour, but tonight it felt eerily abandoned, as though the world had retreated into the shadows. My apartment building loomed ahead, and I quickened my pace, anxious to get inside. I stepped into the lobby of Central Heights, passing by Ray the doorman and offering a polite nod to his wave. Normally I would have stopped to chat, but I was too tired and was just looking forward to a bath, a stiff drink, and maybe a TV show before I collapsed into sleep. As I made my way toward the elevator, I was already scrolling through my phone for something to watch while waiting for the long ride to the 16th floor. I pressed the button and suddenly felt a strange sensation. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I felt like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. No one was in the lobby. Ray was still at his station, absorbed in a novel. It must have been nothing, I tried to reassure myself. Yet the feeling persisted, like unseen fingers trailing along my spine. When the elevator finally arrived, I stepped in without hesitation. I quickly pressed 16 and waited. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something odd, a powdery white dust near the elevator console. I checked myself to make sure I hadn't gotten any on me, but there was no trace of it on my clothes or skin. Then I looked closer and saw a chalk-like smudge right on the console between the numbers 12 and 14. A disturbing chill ran through me as my hand hovered near the strange mark. I paused, processing the bizarre sight before the bell chimed and the doors opened to my floor. Shrugging off the unease, I stepped off. I walked down the hall to my apartment and sighed with relief that my day was over. As I approached my door, eager to collapse onto my couch, I rummaged through my bag. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized my keys were still at the hospital, left on the break room counter. I groaned and trudged back to the elevator, resigned to having to retrieve them. I pressed the down button, and after a brief wait, the door opened not far from where I stood. To my surprise, I wasn't alone in the elevator. There, occupying the small space, was an impossibly large figure draped in a long white coat. Their face was hidden by a hood, and their tall, rail-thin form exuded an unsettling presence. I took an instinctive step back, disturbed by the sight, but I tried to steady myself and not stare. I considered waiting for the next elevator, yet the door wouldn't close. The figure remained motionless, its hood concealing any trace of expression as it stared impassively. Realizing I had no way to get back to my apartment without my keys, I reluctantly stepped into the elevator with the tall figure and pressed the button for the lobby. That's when something made me do a double take. Even with the giant hooded figure standing silently beside me, I noticed an extra button on the panel, a softly glowing 13. It wasn't there earlier when I'd gone up to my own floor. I noticed the 13th button bore a large imprint of white chalky powder, and I saw that the looming figure's feet were also surrounded by that same odd substance. The elevator lurched into motion as I felt a cold dread wash over me. The buttons on the panel flickered in a strange, otherworldly rhythm as the elevator began its descent. The hooded figure beside me remained completely still, filling the confined space with an oppressive silence. I felt its unseen gaze upon me, its face forever obscured by the hood. My breath caught when the elevator slowed, and the digital display above the doors flickered from 14 to a distorted blur, then to a number that sent a chill coursing through my veins. 13. When the doors slid open with a hollow clang, a dimly lit hallway unfolded before me, a place that didn't belong in my building. Thick, damp air spilled out, carrying the scent of old dust mixed with a trace of something metallic. My heart pounded as the figure stepped forward with an unnervingly fluid grace. Pausing in the doorway, it slowly turned its hooded head in my direction, as though silently inviting me to follow. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. My legs refused to budge as my mind screamed for me to run, to shout, to do anything other than step further into that dark, unnatural space. Suddenly, I felt lightheaded and tried to steady myself against the elevator wall, but before I knew it, I crumbled to the floor, unconscious. When I came to, I sat up abruptly and nearly screamed, only to realize that I was still in the elevator. It had descended back to the lobby, and the strange, hooded figure was nowhere to be seen. I had no idea how I had passed out. Perhaps I was more exhausted than I'd thought. Yet it had felt so real, too real. I'd never experienced such a vivid nightmare before. As I stepped out, I glanced back at the elevator panel one last time and noticed a faint smudge of white powder near it. Shaken, I left and headed back to work to retrieve my keys. When I got back to my building, Ray commented on how stressed I looked. I told him it was nothing more than bad nerves after a long day. He nodded, and I pressed on. Yet when I arrived at the elevator again, that inexplicable, unsettling feeling returned. Despite how late it was and how tired I felt, I decided to take the stairs. I was sweating and utterly exhausted after the climb, but eventually I reached my apartment. I chose to forego the bath in favor of a quick shower and then went straight to bed. The next morning, on my way to work, I was disturbed to see paramedics gathered outside the building. Approaching Ray, I asked him what had happened. His face was drawn, his usual smile absent. Leaning in closer and lowering his voice, he said, "It's Mrs. Donovan from 1406. They found her this morning when she didn't answer her door. Her daughter called, worried, when she couldn't reach her." A chill ran through me. What happened to her? "Nobody knows for sure," Ray replied, glancing toward the paramedics. "The police say it looks strange. There are no obvious signs of what killed her, but—" He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "They mentioned she was covered in some kind of white powder, like chalk or something. I've never seen anything like it in my 30 years here." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. White powder, just like in the elevator, just like in my nightmare. "Did you know her?" Ray asked, noticing the pallor in my face. "Not really," I managed to say, my mouth suddenly dry. "I only passed her in the halls sometimes." I tried to recall her face, but all I could conjure was a vague image of an elderly woman with silver hair who always nodded politely when we crossed paths. "They're saying it might have been sudden cardiac arrest, but who knows?" Ray continued. "Poor woman, living alone all these years after her husband passed. At least it was quick, whatever it was." I nodded mechanically, my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. I thanked Ray for the information and mentioned that I had to get to work. Yet deep down, I felt disturbed. I had wanted to dismiss the unsettling news about the tenant found dead, but with that bizarre substance mentioned, it was eerily similar to what I'd seen with that tall, hooded figure. The thoughts clung to me, refusing to let me find any peace. The rest of my workday passed in a hazy blur, and I felt detached from everything as I struggled to process the bizarre events of the previous night. I hurried home with anxious dread gnawing at the back of my mind. Arriving back at my apartment building, I mustered the courage to approach the elevator again. The metallic doors slid open with a soft ding, and though I hesitated for just a moment, I stepped inside. My eyes darted around the small, dimly lit space, half expecting shadows to flicker in the corners. Taking a steadying breath, I pressed the button for my floor while carefully scanning the panel for anything unusual. This time, the area between the numbers 12 and 14 was clean and unmarked, devoid of any peculiar chalky residue. The elevator hummed quietly as it ascended, leaving only the sterile scent of metal and the gentle whir of machinery. I exhaled a sigh of relief at the return to normalcy and walked down the hall to my apartment. Just as I inserted my key into the lock, I heard footsteps approaching down the hall. "Oh hey, I thought that was you." I turned to see Chelsea Matthews, my neighbour from 1604, walking toward me with a reusable grocery bag slung over one arm. Her dark curls were pulled back into a messy bun, and though her face attempted a smile, worry was etched in every line. "Hi, Chelsea," I greeted her with a forced smile. Chelsea glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Did you hear about Mrs. Donovan?" she whispered, her voice tight. I nodded, still holding my key in the door. "Ray told me this morning. It's awful." "I can't stop thinking about it," Chelsea admitted, clutching her grocery bag closer to her chest. "I saw her just 2 days ago in the laundry room. She seemed perfectly fine, even talking about her granddaughter's ballet recital." A chill crept up my spine. "Did Ray mention the white powder they found?" Her eyes widened. "Yes." "That's what's so strange. My sister works at the police station as a clerk, and she couldn't tell me much, but she said the investigators were baffled. It wasn't any kind of drug or poison they recognized, just this weird chalky substance all over her apartment." Her voice dropped even lower. "The medical examiner still hasn't determined a cause of death." My legs felt weak as I leaned against the doorframe. "That's disturbing." "There's something else," Chelsea confided, stepping even closer. "Mrs. Donovan mentioned something weird the last time I saw her. She talked about having nightmares of a tall figure in white visiting her at night." She shook her head. "I assumed it was just an old woman's imagination, you know. But now—" The key slipped from my fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor, making Chelsea jump. "Sorry," I mumbled as I bent to retrieve it with trembling hands. "Did she say anything else about this figure?" Chelsea furrowed her brow. "Just that it was impossibly tall and wore some kind of hood. She mentioned it even left marks on her floor, like footprints or something." She shrugged helplessly. "I figured it was just her medication giving her vivid dreams." My mouth went dry. "And you said this was 2 days ago?" "Yeah," she nodded. "The day before she died." Studying my face, she asked, "Are you okay? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to stand a little taller. "Just tired from work. These double shifts are killing me." I fumbled with my key once more. I should get some rest. "All right then. Take care and stay safe. I'll see you around, and don't work yourself too hard. Have a good rest of the night," Chelsea said, waving as she headed back to her own apartment. I stepped inside my apartment and released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my mind still echoing with all the disturbing things Chelsea had said about Mrs. Donovan and her untimely death. Pushing myself away from the door, I moved through my darkened apartment, flipping on lights as I went. The shadows seemed longer tonight, and the corners of my home appeared darker and more ominous. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of wine with shaking hands, spilling a few drops on the counter, though I didn't bother to wipe them up. The television droned on in the background as I curled up on my couch, wrapping myself in a throw blanket despite the warmth of the apartment. News footage of paramedics outside my building played silently, a reporter discussing the mysterious death of an elderly resident. I quickly changed the channel. Sleep proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, that hooded figure and the impossible 13th floor replayed in my mind. Chelsea's words about Mrs. Donovan's nightmares echoed incessantly, the same nightmares I'd had, the same figure I'd seen. Around midnight, I finally dragged myself to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the occasional creaks and groans of the building settling. My eyelids grew heavy despite my anxiety, and eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start, my alarm blaring beside me. For a moment I felt disoriented, unable to tell if I had truly slept or merely closed my eyes for a few minutes. My body felt heavy and my mind foggy as I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower. The hot water did little to wash away my unease. As I dressed for work, I found myself continuously glancing toward my door, half expecting a knock or the turn of the handle. I chided myself for being irrational, but couldn't shake the dread that had firmly taken root in my mind. My morning routine took longer than usual. Every sound startled me. By the time I was ready to leave, I was already running late. I hesitated at my door, took a deep breath, and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was quiet, with morning light filtering through the windows at each end. I locked my door and headed toward the elevator, only to freeze mid-step. There, in the middle of the hallway, stood Chelsea. I recalled that she worked at a different hospital across town, yet she was in her hospital scrubs, though they looked rumpled as if she'd slept in them. Her hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. "Chelsea?" I called out cautiously. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond at first, remaining perfectly still with her gaze fixed on the wall. Something about her unresponsive stillness sent a chill down my spine. "Chelsea?" I tried again, gently reaching out to touch her shoulder. At my touch, her head snapped toward me, but her eyes remained unfocused, gazing through me rather than at me. Her pupils were dilated, and her face looked unnaturally pale. "It comes at night," Chelsea whispered, her voice raspy and strange. "The shadow of death. It wears white, but leaves darkness. It marks them first. The 13th floor. It's waiting there." My blood ran cold. "Chelsea, what are you talking about? There is no 13th floor." "I saw it last night," she continued, her voice slurring slightly. "In the elevator, the button appeared. White dust, so cold." She shuddered violently. "It knows who's next." I gripped her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Chelsea, snap out of it." Blinking rapidly, Chelsea's eyes gradually focused. Color slowly returned to her face as confusion took over. She looked around, disoriented, before finally recognizing me. Why am I in the hallway?" she murmured, touching her forehead and wincing. "God, I have such a headache. Was I sleepwalking?" "I'm not sure," I said, uncertainly, my eyes still fixed on her face. "You were just standing here talking about strange things." "What things?" she asked, frowning as she rubbed her temples. I hesitated before replying. "About a shadow of death. And the 13th floor." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't remember any of that." Glancing at her watch, she gasped, "Oh God, I'm late." "I need to get to work." She hurried toward the elevator, then paused, and looked back at me with an embarrassed smile. "Sorry about that. Must have been sleepwalking or something. Too many night shifts, you know." Before I could utter a word, Chelsea disappeared around the corner toward the elevator, and I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. The coincidence was too overwhelming, Mrs. Donovan's experience, my own, and now Chelsea mentioning the same horrors. Later at work, I couldn't focus. Twice, I nearly administered the wrong medication to patients, catching myself just in time. Colleagues asked if I was feeling ill, noting my pallor and distracted state. I blamed it on lack of sleep, which wasn't entirely untrue. During my lunch break, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a salad that I had no appetite for. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about my building's history. Central Heights had been built in the 1970s and renovated in the early 2000s. Nothing unusual, a standard high-rise apartment building. I scrolled further until I stumbled across an old newspaper article about an architectural controversy during its construction. The original plans had included a 13th floor, but due to superstition, the developers had labeled it the 14th, skipping 13 altogether. What caught my attention was a small paragraph noting that the chief architect had either gone missing or died mysteriously before construction was completed. His body was never found, either way. My hands trembled as I set down my phone. It couldn't be a mere coincidence. The rest of my shift dragged on endlessly. By the time I clocked out, darkness had fallen, and a fine mist hung in the air, diffusing the streetlights into hazy orbs. I considered taking a different route home, maybe even staying at a hotel for the night, but the thought seemed ridiculous in the rational light of the hospital lobby. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped out into the night. The walk home felt longer than usual, each shadow making my heart skip a beat. When I finally reached my building, I noticed Ray was gone for the day, replaced by a night doorman whose name I couldn't recall, and who barely looked up from his phone as I entered. I hesitated at the elevator, and then decided to head for the stairs, unwilling to risk another encounter. However, when I reached the door to the stairwell, to my shock, it was locked. I turned around and tried to flag down the night doorman, but he had vanished. I looked around, unsure of what to do next, when suddenly the elevator doors opened. I stared at the vacant elevator, its fluorescent light flickering ever so slightly. The interior was pristine, no white powder, no mysterious buttons, no towering figure, just an ordinary elevator waiting patiently for a passenger. Rational thought urged me to step inside, especially since the stairwell was locked and I needed to get to my apartment. Yet my feet remained rooted to the lobby floor, my body refusing the simple command to move. A soft chime sounded as the doors began to close. Acting on instinct, I lunged forward, thrusting my arm between the closing doors. They retracted immediately, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. My finger hovered over the button panel. 16. I could just press 16 and go home. But then my eyes were drawn to the space between 12 and 14, the unmarked space where 13 should be. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud that, in my heightened state, sounded like the slam of a prison gate. I pressed 16 quickly, then backed into the corner, watching the numbers illuminate as the elevator began to ascend. Everything seemed normal at first, and as I ascended I tried to ignore the lingering feeling of dread. I watched the display numbers slowly increase. Then, to my horror, the elevator stopped. It had halted at 12, but the door wouldn't open. Then the number distorted and went blank, and I felt the elevator creeping up several more feet before stopping on a floor higher than the 12th. The door slid open, and there it was. A hooded figure stood in the doorway, impossibly tall, its white coat hanging from skeletal shoulders. I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator, my scream caught in my throat. White dust swirled around the figure's feet, drifting into the elevator like fog. "Please," I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure what I was begging for. The hooded figure bent down and stepped into the elevator. With each step, a noxious cloud of chalky dust spread around it, and I covered my mouth in horror. It extended one impossibly long arm, the sleeve falling back to reveal a hand, made entirely of bone, gleaming white in the dim light. It reached out with slow, deliberate motion. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I won't go with you." The figure tilted its hooded head, as if puzzled by my refusal. It took a step forward. With every movement, white dust billowed, filling the cramped space with a fine mist that made me cough. A cold emanated from it, an otherworldly chill that penetrated my soul and froze my thoughts. Its hand moved toward the panel, paused, then withdrew, as it stepped back into the opposite corner of the elevator. It stood motionless, waiting for the doors to close. I couldn't fathom why it had ignored me, seeming content to ride the elevator up to the 16th floor rather than drag me down into the sepulchral darkness of the 13th. The elevator rose without further incident, the floors passing by in terrible silence as I remained breathless and terrified alongside my monstrous companion. When we arrived at the 16th floor, the entity extended an arm as if bidding me to disembark first. Oddly polite, though still utterly horrifying. I took a nervous step forward, scared of moving, yet even more terrified of staying a moment longer with that skeletal nightmare. I crept past the looming figure and eventually broke into a mad sprint down the hall toward my apartment. I stole one last glance behind me. The thing was gone. Whatever it had been doing on that floor, I couldn't say, but I felt an urgent need to get inside and hide as quickly as possible. I made it to my door, my heart racing as I fumbled with my keys before throwing myself inside, quickly closing and locking the door before bolting to my bedroom. The night stretched on interminably as I huddled beneath my blanket, feeling both foolish and fearful. Part of me knew that the skeletal figure I dreaded wouldn't materialize in my bedroom or elsewhere in my apartment. Yet another part couldn't shake the unsettling anticipation that it might. As the hours dragged by with no sign of the apparition, I hesitated, relieved, yet still anxious, before finally succumbing to an uneasy sleep. That sleep, however, was short-lived. I awoke abruptly to a horrible scream that pierced the quiet night. Bolting upright, my heart pounding, I realized the scream wasn't part of a nightmare. It echoed through the hallway outside my apartment, followed by a heavy thud. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone, as I debated whether to call 911 or hide in the bathroom. A strange compulsion drew me toward the door instead. I pressed my eye to the peephole, my breath fogging the small glass circle. At first I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye, a figure walking slowly toward the elevator. It was Chelsea. Her movements were unnervingly stiff, limbs jerking slightly with each step, as if controlled by invisible strings. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. Behind her loomed that same white-robed figure, impossibly tall, its skeletal frame nearly brushing the ceiling. One bone-white hand hovered inches from Chelsea's back, guiding her without actual contact. White dust billowed with each unearthly step, leaving a trail of chalky footprints on the carpet. "Chelsea," I whispered, my hand clutching the doorknob. I knew I should open the door, or scream, or do something, but my body refused to move. "Chelsea?" And the figure reached the elevator. The doors slid open without either of them pressing a button, revealing an inky darkness. As they stepped inside, Chelsea's head turned slowly, mechanically, toward my apartment. Even through the peephole I could see that her eyes were completely white now, dusted with the same chalky substance trailing behind the hooded figure. Our gazes locked for one terrifying moment before her face went slack again, and she and the figure stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft chime that seemed disturbingly ordinary amid the horror. I stumbled backward from the door, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the floor, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. Chelsea, the figure was taking her to the 13th floor, just as it had tried to take me. Images of Mrs. Donovan's death flashed through my mind, found covered in white powder, dead without explanation. I knew I had to do something. I had to help Chelsea. With trembling hands, I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. My phone showed full service, yet the call failed repeatedly. Frustrated, I tossed the useless device onto the couch and scrambled to my feet, pulling on a sweatshirt over my pajamas and shoving my feet into sneakers. The rational part of me screamed that I should stay inside, lock the door, and wait until morning. But Chelsea was my neighbor, and I had to try and do something. I grabbed a kitchen knife, fully aware that it would be useless against whatever that thing was, yet clinging to the faint feeling of security it provided. I flung open the door and stepped out into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The corridor was empty now, but a ghostly trail of white powder led me to the elevator. Clutching the knife in my sweaty hand, I followed the shimmering, luminescent powder on the carpet. When I reached the elevator, I saw the doors still closed and the indicator light paused between floors. My finger hovered over the call button. Was I really doing this? Was I truly going to follow that thing to wherever it had taken Chelsea? Before I could decide, the indicator light began to move again. The elevator was coming back up. I ducked behind a decorative plant in the corner, crouching low as the elevator chimed its arrival. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car, no sign of Chelsea or the figure, just more of that white powder dusting the floor. I approached slowly, knife extended before me. The elevator's interior had a thicker layer of the powder, swirling gently as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. Something compelled me forward, not curiosity, but a desperate need to find Chelsea and rescue her from whatever fate had befallen Mrs. Donovan. I stepped inside, my shoes leaving prints in the dust. The doors closed behind me, and I realized I hadn't pressed a button. The panel remained dark. "No," I whispered to myself. I was too late. The only trace left was the eerie powder shaped like a skeletal finger, pressed on the section between the 12 and 14 buttons. I stepped off that horrific elevator and walked numbly back to my apartment, praying that all of this was just a terrible dream. The next day, my greatest fears were confirmed. I rushed downstairs as quickly as I could, and upon emerging in the lobby, I saw the police and paramedics gathered outside the building. My heart sank. Ray was back at his post, and noticing my horrified expression as I appeared in the lobby, he confirmed the truth I had been dreading. With an ashen face, he said in a low voice, "Found her in the hallway this morning, just like Mrs. Donovan. No signs of a struggle, no obvious cause." Leaning closer and glancing around the empty lobby, he added, "And that same white powder all over her? The police are saying it might be some kind of toxic substance in the building. They're bringing in specialists today." I gripped the edge of Ray's desk to steady myself. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern deepening the lines on his weathered face. "You look a bit shaken." "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just shocked. I talked to her yesterday. She seemed fine." Ray nodded solemnly. "They're saying it might be some kind of chemical hazard. Management's called an emergency meeting tonight. They are trying not to freak people out." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Between you and me, I've been working here for 16 years. I've never seen anything like this. 2 people in 1 week under the same mysterious circumstances." "Has anyone else reported anything unusual?" I asked, in a barely audible whisper. "Anything about the building? The elevator?" Ray's expression shifted subtly. "Funny you should ask. Mrs. Henderson from 1202 mentioned something about the elevator stopping on a floor that doesn't exist." He shook his head. "I told her she must have pressed the wrong button or imagined it. 13th floor superstition gets to people. This building is old enough to have its quirks." I nodded mechanically. Someone else had seen it. I wasn't losing my mind. "Ray," I said carefully. Have you ever noticed anything strange about the elevator? White powder, maybe? Or unusual people using it late at night? Ray's eyes sharpened as he studied me. Why do you ask? Just curious, I offered, my attempt at casual conversation failing miserably. Glancing around once more, Ray motioned for me to lean closer. There have been stories about this building for years, he whispered. Back in the 70s, during construction, workers refused to continue after dark. They said they saw things. Management called it superstition and fired anyone who complained. He paused before adding, the architect went missing and the foreman died before it was finished, found in the elevator shaft between what would have been the 13th floor. Covered in white powder, I murmured, finishing for him. His eyes widened and he nodded slowly. For a long, heavy moment, Ray was silent. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. I've worked here for 16 years. I've seen residents come and go. I've watched this building age. 3 years ago, the night janitor quit without notice, left his keys, his uniform, everything. He just disappeared. Before he left, he told me something I've never forgotten. He swallowed hard. He said he'd seen death itself in the service elevator, wearing a heavy white coat. A chill ran down my spine. And did you believe him? I didn't, Ray admitted. I thought he was hitting the bottle too hard. But then he trailed off, glancing toward the bank of elevators. I've seen things too. Glimpses. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. Why haven't you left? I asked quietly. Ray's expression hardened. This is my home. It has been for a long time. Whatever's happening, I'm not letting it chase me away. He straightened, returning to his professional demeanor. You should be careful. Maybe stay with family for a few days until they figure out what's going on. I nodded, though I knew no investigation would uncover the truth. What was happening defied all rational explanation. Thank you, Ray, I said, turning toward the door. I'll be careful. I briefly considered taking the day off from work, but I decided against it, since I figured I could use the distraction to ignore the insanity swirling around me there. At the busy hospital, I almost forgot the horrors of the night before. But as my shift ended, the dread of returning home settled over me. I lingered for a while, making small talk with colleagues who were just starting their shifts, anything to delay the inevitable. Outside, twilight had fallen. The streets were quieter than usual, or perhaps it only seemed so to me, as each echoing footstep counted down the moments until I got back to my home. Central Heights loomed ahead, its windows lit against the darkening sky. How many residents had no idea what lurked between the floors? How many came and went, oblivious to the horror stalking the hallways at night? As I approached the entrance, I noticed a small crowd gathered outside. Police tape cordoned off part of the sidewalk, and officers were speaking with some residents. An ambulance idled nearby, lights off, but doors open. What's happening? I asked, a pale-faced woman hovering at the edge of the crowd. The woman turned and said in a shaky tone, Another one. Mrs. Henderson, from 1214, found her in the stairwell about an hour ago. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman Ray had mentioned, who'd seen the 13th floor. My legs nearly gave way. White powder? I asked, already dreading the answer. She nodded. That's what they're saying, just like the others. 3 deaths in 1 week. People are talking about moving out. I pushed through the crowd toward the entrance. Ray wasn't at his post, probably being questioned by the police, and the other night doorman looked visibly shaken. Excuse me? He called as I passed. They're advising residents to stay elsewhere tonight if possible. Building management is putting people up at the Coventry Hotel until they determine if there's an environmental hazard. Thanks, I mumbled in a terrified daze. I wasn't in any mood to argue. I headed for the Coventry Hotel, hoping for a night's safety away from the building and its haunting spectre of death. After checking into my room, my mind whirled with doubt and fear. The terrifying enigma of Central Heights dominated my thoughts, compelling me to consider leaving. Whatever was happening in that building, be it a deadly hallucinogenic powder or the grim spectre of death itself, it did not matter anymore. I had to get out. The urge to flee was overwhelming, though a small, nagging part of me hesitated at the idea of abandoning the familiar for the unknown. I didn't have much money, and while I could potentially find a smaller place and hire movers to leave that cursed building behind, the decision felt more daunting than ever. I eventually resolved to leave and find someplace else to live. It was a hasty decision, but I grimly speculated that it might be a life or death situation, and I shuddered at the thought of the people I knew who had already been taken. With that resolution, I tried to settle down, and at last I fell into a relatively comfortable sleep. Then, as if in the very next moment, my eyes snapped open in a flash. To my horror, I was alone in the elevator. White dust was everywhere, on the floor, swirling in the air, coating my skin. The numbers on the panel flickered, and a single glowing button remained: 13. I hadn't pressed it, but the elevator moved anyway, descending to a floor that shouldn't exist. When the doors opened, I didn't see a hallway, but a vast, cavernous space. White dust drifted like snow in stagnant air. In the center stood that hooded figure, even taller than before, its skeletal hands extended toward me. At its feet lay 3 bodies, Mrs. Donovan, Chelsea, and Mrs. Henderson, their skin bleached white, eyes open, yet unseeing. Behind the figure, more shapes emerged from the swirling dust. Dozens, hundreds of them, all victims of the thing that dwelled between floors. And it was waiting for me to join them. Despite my overwhelming horror, a strange compulsion tugged at me, defying all logic. Before I could resist, my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the morbid sight. The doors closed behind me with a metallic groan, and in the distance I heard the faint hum of the retreating elevator, leaving me alone with that enigmatic figure. It moved ahead, its long coat dragging along the floor and leaving a trail of white, chalky dust. In a daze, I followed as the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a shroud. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, its walls lined with doors that bore no resemblance to those in my own building. They were older, heavier, each adorned with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Abruptly, the figure halted, tilting its head slightly as if straining to listen to something. I strained my ears, desperate to catch any sound, but only near silence met me. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to hear a faint whisper, soft and indistinct, steadily growing louder. The sound sent shivers down my spine, completely out of place in that world. The figure turned to face me, and for the first time I noticed a subtle movement beneath its hood. Shadows twisted and writhed within. My breath caught as the figure raised a hand, its impossibly long, pale fingers pointing toward a door at the far end of the hall. As the whisper grew clearer, a jolt of terror struck me when I heard my name called repeatedly, in a voice disturbingly familiar. The door at the end of the hall creaked open by itself, revealing a space bathed in eerie, flickering light. I took a hesitant step back, but it was too late. The figure seized my arm with a cold, unyielding grip and pulled me forward. I stumbled toward the open door as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and in that moment I stepped through the threshold into a nightmare from which I might never awake. And yet I did wake, gasping and tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. The hotel room was dark except for the red glow of the digital clock reading 3:13 a.m. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing ordinary hotel furnishings. No dust, no figures, just a bland room with standard artwork and heavy curtains drawn against the night. I collapsed back onto the pillows, trying to slow my breathing. It had just been a nightmare. But as I glanced toward the carpet near the door, I saw a fine white powder dusting the threshold, as if someone or something had tried to enter. Frozen, I stared at the white trace. It hadn't been there when I checked in. Then a sinking dread gripped me. My eyes darted down to my feet, now engulfed in a thick layer of the eerie, chalky substance. Panic surged as I bent to touch my foot, and there it was, a bruise, vivid and sinister, marking the exact spot where an otherworldly hand had seized my arm with unyielding force. Desperation clawed at my mind as I scrambled for a shred of logic, but only chaos answered. The figure had found me. Even here, miles from Central Heights, it had tracked me down. Or perhaps I had even ventured into its lair in my sleep. It couldn't be real, but the powder by the door and on my feet was real. The deaths were real, and whatever was hunting me wouldn't stop until it had claimed me too. I hurriedly dressed, hands shaking as I stuffed my few belongings into a bag. I knew I had to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and everything here. I crossed several state lines and did not have a destination, besides as far away as I could get from that nightmare and the being that might even now still be searching for me. Yet even abandoning my possessions and leaving, doubt still gnaws at my resolve. Perhaps leaving the city entirely and abandoning everything might be enough. But deep down, I wonder whether it could ever be enough. I don't know if I can ever outrun the shadow of death itself that haunts the 13th floor.
For more scary stories, like and subscribe.